Hello, you're listening to Work Learning and Social Change, Foundational Voices, a research presentation and one-on-one discussion series featuring the people and the analyses that are defining the field. Recorded at a live event in January 2024, in this episode, we learn about a new book entitled Tipping Point for Advanced Capitalism, Class Consciousness, and Activism in the Knowledge Economy, the latest, from the University of Toronto Professor Emeritus, DW Livingstone.
Okay, so good to see everyone tonight. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to the book launch for Professor David W. Livingstone's new book, Tipping Point for Advanced Capitalism, Class Consciousness, and Activism in the Knowledge Economy. We are excited to be hosting this here at OISE, where Professor Livingstone worked for decades, and the Center for Learning, Social Economy, and Work to be sponsoring this event for our first for 2024. My name is Hye-Su Kuk. I am an assistant professor in the Adult Education and Community Development Program, where CLUSO resides. I'm also on the executive committee of CLUSO. First, a little bit about CLUSO. The mandate of the Center for Learning, Social Economy, and Work, or CLUSO, is to convene and support research, events, knowledge mobilization, and organizing activities concerning all forms of work and learning in the social economy and the public and private sectors. CLUSO formed in 2014 with the merger of two older and storied OISE research centers, the Social Economy Center and the Center for the Study of Education and Work, the latter led by Professor Livingstone. CLUSO has been committed for a decade now to social and economic justice while bringing together scholars, students, community organizers, organizations, and activists dedicated to understanding and enriching the often under-recognized contributions of socioeconomic activity and work to highlight the full range and variation of learning dynamics in Canadian society and internationally. To find out more about CLUSO and our activities, just Google CLSEW and OISE to browse our website. Tipping Point for Advanced Capitalism, Class Consciousness, and Activism in the Knowledge Economy is a vital book for our times, addressing the most crucial issues concerning class and workers' activism as we continue into this phase of advanced capitalism. Tonight's event will unfold as follows. Professor David Livingstone will give a presentation of about 25 minutes. Then Randy Robinson of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives and Wally Seckham, co-founder of Black Creek Community Farm, will spend about 10 minutes each responding to the book. Then Professor Livingstone will offer some final follow-up comments, and we will open up the floor for Q&A. And remember, if you haven't already, there is food in the room at the back and beverages, and also we have copies of the book for sale. And now I would like to invite Professor Livingstone for his book launch.
Thank you very much. I was very glad to accept the invitation for this launch for two basic reasons. The first of which is I retired formally from teaching and student supervision from this very spot over a decade ago, partially so I could ensure that I would complete the analysis of the data that we had gathered through the Knoll and the Wall research projects, which a few of you were involved in over the prior decade. And I'm very glad to tell you that the Tipping Point book is the final piece of that commitment. So after tonight, I'm done. Secondly, I'm very glad to be able to accept an invitation to virtually anything from Clouseau, because as Hye-Su has mentioned, it's the merger of Hye-Su and social economy, Jack's center and mine. And I hope that the work that continues over the next decades through Clouseau will find the legacy of both the work that Jack's center did and my center did will endure. So I sincerely hope that happens. First thing I'd like to do, just to begin, is to ask for a show of hands. And gentlemen, you can help me tally here in these two questions. First, I'd like just a show of agreement first on the first statement. It is possible for a modern economy to run effectively without the profit motive. How many agree? Got a tally there? Okay. Second question. Non-management could run things without bosses. Slightly more reluctance, but okay. That's, if you can just hold that profile in your mind for a moment, we will proceed. So these are some links, and if anybody who's not familiar with my work wants to find more of it, look anywhere in the internet under DW Livingstone. There are a lot of connections there that will be useful to you if you're interested in pursuing any of this stuff further. Including the book and the resources that went into building it. Let me start with a few contradictory declared facts. So the same guy, Al Jaber, who you will have heard of in December as the president of COP28, who claimed at that point that the climate challenge become the drivers of the new economic age. 2 days later, as the CEO of ADCO, he declared that we will continue record investment in oil and gas production to satisfy demand for fossil fuels. Slight contradiction. But it's reflective of the times that we're living in, that we have this contradiction being foisted on us. We are at a tipping point now that very few people face with intimate reality, but it's there if you want to face facts. The first of which is an environmental degradation. It's almost irreversible. We're within a few minutes, 90 seconds in fact, of nuclear winter, underlined by the Ukraine war and the Israel-Palestine conflict. And we have historic highs in inequitable concentration of wealth and lows in the popular confidence in elected governments addressing it. So it's increasingly difficult for dominant capitalist class leaders like Al Jaber to use habitual references to market demand to plausibly deny very dangerous time and the urgent demand for transformative change. But our reality is partly that we have an institutionalized logic in all capitalist firms to maximize profits by turning every possible conceivable good and service into a commodity for sale, irregardless of sustainability of life. And most of us, most of the time, we got to say, are accepting that in ways that basically ignore the connection of commodity comfort with profit maximization. And in that same respect, most of us are paying little attention to class-grounded and paid work relations between employers, managers, and workers. And that's really the point of this book, to try and reconnect those relations. In fact, there have been very few studies of class structure in paid work relations over the last 4 decades, in fact, and hardly any on higher levels of class consciousness, which I'll talk most about here, to say nothing of connections between class and class consciousness. So the basic purpose of this book is summarized in the underlined piece of this slide. Shine light on the changing class structure of paid work explore forms of class consciousness in a novel way, and assess the connections between class consciousness and action to defend or transform advanced capitalism, and to provoke further studies on these questions. There's a set of resource bases here that I'll come back to at the end and perhaps during our discussion. But what are the reasons for this exclusion or ignoring or suppressing of class analysis? I suggest there are a couple that are legitimate, and these are clearly gender and race composition, more than class composition of much of our reality and paid work in the last several decades. The long march of women into paid employment has continued, and this is a striking slide to me, that in 1976, roughly a quarter of women who had kids under 6 were in paid work. Now it's almost 3/4. So the march of women into paid work, with all of the ramifications, has been an overriding reality for many people in our society. Secondly, if we look at the presence of visible minorities, and this includes both non-white populations and Aboriginal populations, including First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, this proportion has gone from something around 4% to nearly a third of the labor force of Canada within a very short time, basically 4 decades. So these tremendous changes are very visible and evident to all of us, and they have been of overwhelming interest to a lot of scholars, for example, quite legitimate and compelling studies in all of these respects of gender and race composition and the issues that are involved. But there is one other factor that I need to mention at this point, and that is class warfare. Some choice quotes here from some of the advocates of capitalist offensive. And basically what has been happening over this period from the 1970s on is in the wake of a capital labor share that was challenging to corporate profits, and the highest membership in trade unions that we'd ever had by 1980 in mostly all advanced capitalist countries. This offensive began to target particular groups of workers, and that is specifically industrial workers, more specifically organized workers in manufacturing, such as steel and auto. And that resulted in this process in the decline of industrial workers as a proportion of the labor force in all of these countries, the G7 and the Nordic countries in particular, which are the focus of this book. And guess what? At the same time, organized labor in the private sector dropped like a rock. Not so much in Canada as in some other countries, but if you look at Great Britain and the United States in particular, where Reaganism and Thatcherism were alive and well from the early 1980s on, very substantial drops related to these offenses. So what I want to do to start is to give you a basic profile of the class structure of advanced capitalist societies based on third work relations, with a focus on Canada, but the structure is not much different in most of these other countries. There are variations that are useful to know, but this is the basic slide I want to focus on to begin with class structure. Essentially, we have owners, we have managers, and non-managerial workers. Amongst the owners, this is not proportionate. If it were, the corporate capitalists would be a tiny speck, because they are very, very small and very, very powerful. Then we have large employers. By large, I mean any employer who has more than 10. It could be hundreds, but this is a group that's less than 1%. And then the other small employers are basically people in very small businesses, under 10, and most of them are working in the business themselves. So they may be self-exploiting as well as exploiting others. And then you have the classic self-exploited, self-employed. These people of mom and pop stores, they may be a guy exploiting his wife, but they're not hiring anybody else. And they're 10%. The rest of these folks are small, very small. And then we have in the middle managers who have been delegated by the employers to coordinate and surveil their employees and control them. And finally, you have two-thirds of the workforce who are non-managerial, and this includes the groups I just mentioned here: professional employees, service workers, and industrial workers. What's been happening over the last 40 years in all of these countries is that you've had a decline of the industrial workers, as I've already alluded to, but you've also had a growth of the non-managerial professional employees, otherwise known as knowledge workers, who are supposed to be the focal group in the knowledge economy. So industrial workers have declined, professional employees have substantially grown, about doubled in this period, and the only other group that has significantly changed its proportion is middle managers, basically to increasingly surveil and control the non-managerial workers as we increasingly are involved, and they're increasingly involved in knowledge work. So the middle managers that are there to account for the knowledge workers effectively, if I want to put this very simply. So take this as a basic profile of the class structure of advanced capitalism in Canada today with these specific proportions. And as I say, professional employees have increased. This is a source to the comparative political economy database that Wally will speak about a bit later. Clearly growth of professional employees in all of these countries. The distinctive feature for Canadian professional employees is that, number one, we have the highest level of post-secondary in education completion in the advanced capitalism world. But we lag the Nordics in particular in terms of the proportion with non-professional, non-managerial professional jobs. Ergo, we have a lot of people who are highly educated who are underemployed. Not only they're underemployed, but their working conditions are increasingly like those of non-managerial work, other non-managerial workers. And that's actually the case in all of these countries. The conditions of the so-called knowledge worker, professional employee, are increasingly similar to those of other non-managerial workers. And I make an argument that they're an emerging new working class. And there is a study that I just want to briefly allude to here, because it's the only one that's been done in the world, to my knowledge, that recognizes that all professionals are not the same class. There are at least 4: professional owners, self-employed professionals, professional managers, and non-managerial employees who are the bulk. And yes, Virginia, there is no professional managerial class. That book documents it. So I want to spend most of my time on class consciousness. And basically, there are 3 distinguishable levels of class consciousness that at least scholars recognize. First of which is class identity. You think you're in a class, and if so, what is it? And most people do that one. Small percentage of people will refuse and deny that classes exist, but most people will recognize that they're in a class position. It may be consumption-oriented or education-oriented, but most people identify themselves in a class, consumption class at least. Then secondly, oppositional consciousness, and there's much less attention to this, but basically it's the distinction between the rights of capital and the rights of labor. Where do you situate yourself in terms of an interest linked to either of those groups? And that, I'm arguing, is the pivot point for the development of class consciousness. And finally, and this is actually where I'm going to end up this argument, you have notions of visions of alternative societies. And I've given a couple of examples here. Do you believe in managerial capitalism? In other words, that profit maximization is peachy and managerial prerogative is natural? Or do you believe that there's some hope for economic democracy? Started my research, and there's a whole chapter at the beginning of the book on popular notions of social class. So where Marx started capital with commodity, I'm starting with social class as a simple notion. But from there, we go on to identify combinations. Class consciousness can be seen not as a jigsaw puzzle necessarily, but as a combination of these levels of identity, oppositional consciousness, and a sense of vision of alternative. If you put them together in different ways, you get different possibilities. And if I just look at the extremes, just to see the way in which this can be combined, constructed, you look at this slide and you see what you have to have to be hegemonic capitalist conscious. You have to have an upper middle class identity. You have to support profit maximization and oppose many aspects of the right to strike. And you have to have a capitalist vision of society, profit-driven managerial prerogative. If you believe in all of those things, you have hegemonic capitalist consciousness, and you probably see the society we're in now as quite natural and perfectly normal. At the other extreme, revolutionary labor consciousness, you recognize that you're in a subordinate class status, you have opposition to profit maximization, and you support the right to strike as a fundamental right for workers. And finally, you have some notion of non-profit economy and worker self-management. And from the show of hands, we in fact have some people in this room who believe that. Good start. So here is a distribution of class consciousness in Canada in the most recent evidence base that we have, which is our national survey in 2016. There are a couple of ways of reading this, but just look at it for a second. What is most common for most researchers, most advocates, most commentators on class consciousness is that most people have contradictory consciousness. They don't really know where they are in terms of class interests. They have some kind of a mix, or they have uncertainty. And then we have the people with hegemonic capitalist consciousness who are quite clear about the naturalness of the current order. That's the prevalent discourse about class consciousness. Mostly confused, and then we have the capitalist hegemons. That's not the only way of looking at this process. If you look at this from the point of view of those who have a oppositional labor consciousness, there is a ratio of the last two columns to the first two columns of basically 10 to 1. There are more people with revolutionary and oppositional labor consciousness than hegemonic and pro-capital oppositional consciousness by an order of 10 to 1. The point I'm making is that there are ways to look at class consciousness that recognize the potentials for oppositional and revolutionary development politically. And there are a lot of people who, in fact, have those views. So this is really just another way of saying the same thing. Are we in a condition of ideological hegemony, or are we in one of emergence of transformative social movements? I'm arguing that you can see the second alternative if you look. And I'll now just say a little bit about a few connections here. Class consciousness and policy options first. We did a study in 1982, or Wally Clement and John Miles at Carleton did this study, and I built on it. And they found that at that point, in terms of support for the poor, hegemonic capitalists, a third of them gave some begrudging support. That has decreased. Whereas revolutionary labor has increased from 80% to virtually unanimity. And those with revolutionary labor consciousness have substantially increased, probably doubled in this period, whereas those with hegemonic consciousness have not. that's room for some hope amongst progressive folks. Secondly, global warming. Only have indications for this in 2016, not previously. It wasn't an issue in the early 80s for many people. And here you look at the contrast between revolutionary labor. 94% agree it's a threat to human survival. Hegemonic capitalists, some begrudgingly recognize this as a possible issue that we might be concerned about as long as we have a net zero and a profit maximization possibility. I want to then connect class and class consciousness very briefly. And here, the basic argument is that subordinated classes should have a labor consciousness, dominant classes should have a capitalist consciousness. And lo and behold, that's what we find. But it's interesting to look at the actual patterns. And one of the things that strikes me, if you look at this slide, is that the major change in this period, first, the predictable patterns occur. That is to say, people who are in subordinate class position down bottom tend to have a labor consciousness, a pro-labor consciousness. At the top, amongst the dominant group, and this is only around 2% of labor force, large employers and upper managers have, and this is particularly since the Great Recession of 2007-8, when we had too big to fail corporate bailouts, a lot of people who were in the upper sector became disinclined to celebrate profit maximization. That was a substantial change in terms of capitalist allies. And secondly, with regard to the general issue of labor conscious, of hegemonic and revolutionary consciousness, you find that if you look down at the bottom here, that there has been a substantial, around 10% now, and it was about half of that in 1982. So there has been significant gain in terms of the proportion of the subordinated classes who conceive the possibility of a future that's anti or non-capitalist. And here, it's basically making the same argument and observing, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. So I won't go into this particular mathematics of this, except to say that there are a lot more people who have both pro-labor consciousness and revolutionary consciousness than the opposite extreme. Unfortunately, corporate capitalists are somewhat more concentrated, and they also still have significant numbers of corporate allies, although those are declining in the upper managerial work for what that might be worth. And just with regard to these strategic class groups and highest class consciousness and policy options, what we find is even further support for this polarization, with more people with revolutionary consciousness among non-managerial employees, and increasingly supportive of progressive policy. For example, support for the poor, almost all supportive of that option at this point. Whereas amongst the dominant group, employers, upper managers, not corporate capitalists, because they're not measurable in this particular 2016 study, there's slightly declining opposition. So one indication of weakening amongst the upper classes and support in opposition to the poor. And similarly, with regard to global warming, virtually all non-managerial employees of revolutionary consciousness are actively committed to fighting global warming, whereas employers, upper managers are at least or at most divided on that issue. So finally, just to conclude this part of the analysis, we have a decline of pro-capital oppositional consciousness, especially among corporate allies, We have pro-labor oppositional consciousness remaining much greater, now with near unanimous concern amongst those workers sharing it with the threat of global warming for human survival and poverty reduction. And we have increasing revolutionary labor consciousness among non-managerial workers. I won't go into itemizing the distinctive features of this, except to say we are in a very distinctive moment now. There have been all sorts of claims about this time being different. I believe this time truly is different in terms of the very limited time opportunities we've got to do anything to reconcile the challenges in front of us. So just a few points about the elements of major social change: critique and protest, alternative model, and strategic agencies. First point is that there is increasing public concern about climate change, as well as majority willingness to change how they live and work to reduce its effects. And there is an unprecedented scale and growth of social protest movements in the past decade. Unprecedented scope and scale of social movements, people voting with their feet in the streets in virtually all societies. There's been a hiatus around COVID, but it's reemerging again, as you all know. So just an example of a study that I did with Wally's assistants in 2020 on the notion of whether Canada's economy should be transformed into a more democratic system, focusing on needs of all Canadians and environmental stability. And guess what? There are only two groups in which there is not majority support for this proposition, and that happens to be large employers and corporate capitalists. Secondly, with regard to an alternative, economic democracy is what I am arguing is in front of us if we want to engage with it. Worker self-management, and also cooperative sustainable production being key principles. And CLUSO and other organizations should be focused on this as an alternative and recognize the ways and means of facilitating it. Here's just one example, which links to the show of hands. Gentlemen, can you tell me what our proportion was?
Well, I'm not a pollster, but it looked like it was like 7 or 8 on each side with some overlap where people voted twice.
Okay, so interestingly enough, this room ain't much different than the population as a whole. It's around half now. But as you can see, 82 to 2016, there has been a significant gain, particularly in those who see a no-profit economy as viable. And that's a shard that you should grasp. You should recognize that that kind of latent potentiality is around us. There are a lot of people who see that as a possibility, who have it at least implicitly as a vision. And you can dismiss the notion of an attitude expression on a survey as being superficial, ephemeral, and surely it doesn't necessarily translate into committed action, but it's in potential and it's growing. And if you look at it here in terms of the class breakdown, the significant change is that there's been a gain across the board, even amongst the large employer and upper manager groups. Minuscule as they are, they have a certain pivotal class role to play in relationship to support for capitalists. And so finally, the main point I want to conclude with is that small numbers can be transformative. And in fact, most of the historical research that's been done on social movements has demonstrated that it's relatively small groups of people who get organized, act concertedly on genuine resonating democratic demands, who make follow through on major changes. This can be in regime change or policy change. Some people have documented the 3.5 rule, or Erica Chernowith, for example, as somebody may have heard of, has done this kind of historical research. Whenever there's a concerted group that is organized and proceeds effectively to resonate and to mobilize other people, other groups, at least tacitly, major changes can occur. So here's just a few examples of some of the issues on democratic demand that are mobilizable now if there are groups, politically organized groups, in and around, under political parties, which is another story that Wally will begin to join. That restoration of decent wages, health and education benefits lost since the beginning of that neoliberal offensive in 1980, ending subsidies and supports for fossil fuel development, vast majority support, economic democracy policies. Many people might not know that phrase, but they would support greater job control, particularly for unemployed, overqualified people, more socially useful production, shorter work weeks, maybe universal guaranteed income in relationship to that. And funding such changes partly through excess profit taxes to reverse rounds of corporate tax reductions and bailouts and excessive wealth would be extraordinarily popular. Oxfam has documented that recently. Public debt level would still be no more than we tolerated during World War II, and most people now recognize we are in a war to cope with global warming. So the final essential question is, can we collectively act with clear understanding of the most liable class forces and the most transformative class forces and allies, many of whom are focused on legitimate and compelling race and gender justice issues, to change course before fossil fuel, global investment fund elites, and other capitalist forces drive us to oblivion? Essential question. My final point is just an appeal, and I've been trying to launch this with everybody I can recently, because the set of studies and surveys that we've done, since that one was done in '82 by Clement and Miles, are very lonely at this point. There's virtually nobody else who's been doing this kind of assessment. And I would say it's desperately needed to understand the class dynamics of advanced capitalism today. And so if there's anybody that any of you know who might be interested in that, the data, the resources, the surveys, et cetera, are all available on this Borealis site, including the Canada Work Learning Surveys, which are really a template base for this. So I encourage any of you who know or learn of anybody who is interested in doing any studies of class and class consciousness and advanced capitalism today to consider the space. I'd be delighted to work with anybody who wants to do it on an advisory basis. But that's really the essential message I have here, that I hope that not only will the legacy of Center for Study of Education and Work carry on through CLUSO, but the legacy of this work on class and class consciousness will be carried on by some hardy souls in the near future. Thank you very much.
Who's up? You up? Okay, so yeah. See what she announces.
Thank you so much. A lot of questions on my mind, but I'll leave that in my head for the open session. I now want to invite Randy.
I don't need that. Serious goes. There we go.
Well, thanks very much for having me here. Thanks for the invitation, David. It's great to be here at Boise. I did graduate from Boise a long time ago, so It's nice to be on the 12th floor again. I think this place was always here, but it was different. I think the best thing you can say about a nonfiction book sometimes is that it's thought-provoking. And I found this book to be extremely thought-provoking, not because I have a great technical understanding of the way the surveys were conducted or the way the data was analyzed, but because it just made me think of a lot of things. So with your indulgence, I'm going to sort of share some of those things that it made me think of. The first thing I want to say is I'm with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, which is a progressive think tank. We get more media hits than the Fraser Institute, as a matter of fact. Thank you very much. This issue of the tipping point for advanced capitalism, especially as it relates to inequality, is very much along the lines of the kind of thing that we work on. So the Ontario office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives was opened in 2012, and initially it was called the Growing Gap Project, and it was about inequality right from the start, and that's a topic that we've never let go of. More recently, David McDonald in our national office, he's our senior economist in the national office in Ottawa, published his annual report on CEO salaries, which you probably heard of because that's the kind of thing that ends up in about, actually I know the number, 3,000 news stories every year. So what that report said, as you probably know, is that Canada's highest paid CEOs, the top 100, raked in an average of $14.9 million in 2022, which is a new record. Congratulations, guys, and they mostly are guys. The name of the report was Canada's New Gilded Age. And that seems to be the kind of era that we're living in at a time when you can just see these fountains of money that are out there at the same time as there isn't a city in Canada of any size that doesn't have a tent city, which is occupied by people who have essentially fallen out of the bottom of the economy and are getting absolutely nothing from this wonderful world of advanced capitalism. So the things that Tipping Point for Advanced Capitalism tackles are very interesting to us. I think the most important question that it tackles is something that we all have to think about, which is there any reason to have hope? Because there might not be, so it's worth exploring whether or not there is any reason to have hope. And when I say hope, I mean hope for the future, hope for the world, because we see the climate emergency, we see the extreme inequality, and we know that both of them are largely driven by advanced capitalism for the simple reason that advanced capitalism is driving things. But when you live inside of capitalism, it's kind of hard to see the way it works. You know, we've all heard the expression, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, right? And I just think that's a profound thought. But another one is this idea of the tipping point, because I think we've also all heard the line from Lenin, which is that sometimes there are decades when nothing happens, and sometimes there are weeks when decades happen. And I think in a way, we're all hoping for those weeks to come, as long as they go our way, because they can also go the other way. But this idea of the tipping point, I think, is very profound just as a topic. I don't know if you saw it, but this past Monday, which is January 22nd, 2 days ago, the Toronto Star editorial was actually about our CEO pay report, which is kind of nice. It's a special treat for us. The Star called for robust debate on how to address income inequality and stagnating wages for most workers because, quote, it's not good enough to pull the covers over our heads every January and go back to sleep. And that's the problem. The problem we face right now isn't that nobody sees the inequality or that nobody understands that we're in a climate emergency. We do see it. Everybody sees it. It's widely reported. You can't ignore it unless you actually do have the covers over your head. The problem is we're not doing anything about it. Or if we are doing about it, we're doing so little that it doesn't seem to be anywhere near being enough. And we're not detecting any trend that says it's going to be enough. And yet, as David Livingstone's book, I'll every time I say David now, I mean this David, not David McDonald, who wrote the CELK report. So David's book, makes it very clear there is widespread dissatisfaction with the status quo. More people dislike it than like it. That people know it's not working. And furthermore, there are lots of people who are working on what David has called modeled alternatives that are championing economic democracy and a switch to environmental sustainability. That's what happens when you touch computers. Just go back the way you were. Hang on 1 second here, sorry. I know it's a bit of a distraction. I'm just gonna go. I'm not gonna do anything. I'm just gonna go, how about home? How about right there? That's one. Okay, there are people working on modeled alternatives, and we have a lot of people waiting in the wings who know about economic democracy, who know about environmental sustainability, and they're ready to make that transition happen if they get the chance. But compared to advanced capitalism, the level of organization of these people and groups is quite small and quite dispersed as well. Now, you might think of the left in Canada or around the world as very powerful, but if you think of the right and its control of capital, it's on a totally different scale, if you ask me. You think about something like the invasion of Normandy. Right now, we're at the stage where Walmart could organize that. They are so big and so organized and so powerful because of all the wealth that they control. In a way, this is the way I picture it, thought-provoking. It's kind of like we're at the end of the Cretaceous period, which is when for about 100 million years you had very small mammals, mostly the size of rats, maybe as big as a badger, living side by side with dinosaurs. And that went on for 20, 50, 100 million years. Mammals and dinosaurs did live together. And not to be a prisoner of my own metaphor, but what did it take for mammals to replace dinosaurs? Because we have mammals now, but we don't have dinosaurs, so something must have happened. And what did happen 66 million years ago was a massive disaster. A comet 10 miles wide, 16 kilometers wide, crashed into the Earth and dug a hole 10 miles deep, 16 kilometers deep, and basically blew up the atmosphere. Extinction was like 75% of all species went extinct. There was a real battle between reptiles and mammals won, but only just barely, because the reptiles could not function in this new world. So when we talk about tipping points, one of the things that one thought that's provoked in me is what will push advanced capitalism over the edge? Will it take a disaster, or can society be transformed just because it makes sense to do so and because most people want to see that transformation happen? I don't know the answer. Nobody knows the answer to that. But to get back to the book for a second, what is the role of class in this transformation that we want to see, the good transformation? At the moment, it's hard to say that class is playing a big role in people's understanding of the world. And I think David has made that point quite clearly. If you look at Ontario, for example, there's clearly a ruling class at work. Take a look at the Greenbelt scandal. Okay, the way this was set up was a very small group of people made arrangements to have $8 billion worth of public wealth transferred to them. And they almost got away with it, but they got caught. It's all public. It's all out in the open. The ruling class made an attempt to loot the province. Everybody knows it. And yet, the government of Ontario's popularity today is just as high as it was 6 months ago before any of this came out in the open. My colleague Ricardo Tranjan is from Brazil, and he has an expression which I can't really pronounce in Portuguese, but it's kind of like rouba mais faz, which means he steals, but he gets things done. Right? Did I get it right?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. And that's the kind of world that suddenly we find ourselves in. He steals, but he gets things done. There's a great acceptance of the system, even though it's crooked, it's rigged, and even though people tell pollsters something different. The ruling class, which we can define as owners of productive capitals, plus their various agents in government, the media, academia, and so on, is very good at acting as a class. They're great at it. They've got this built. And when they're upset, they express their upsetness. My favorite thing is the most successful political party fundraising event in Canadian history was a year ago, when the provincial Tories in Ontario raised $6 million in one night at a $1,600 a plate dinner. This year, they had to cancel it because the developers who bought the tickets last year won't buy them this year. That's how you flex your muscle, right? When you're a class. They know what to do. They know how to run things. And we're having no such luck. The, excuse me, the productive class, the non-managerial working class, is not having that kind of success in controlling things. And this has to do with the way that the ruling class maintains its hegemony. First of all, the term middle class came up a long time ago, but whoever weaponized it the way it has been weaponized did a really good job. Because what the idea of the middle class does is it takes the production relations that are the real relations of class and kind of throws a blanket over them. It's like there's a bunch of toys on the bed. You throw a blanket over them, you don't know what those toys are. They could be anything. You don't really see it clearly anymore. And the middle class, and I think David referred to this, is really defined by its relationship to consumption. When you go to work, you're being exploited. When you walk in as a customer, you're royalty. It's great, right? I always tell people, if you want to feel rich, go into the LCBO. It's just heaven, right? It's where rich people go. It feels that way. But, think of the middle class dream: a house, a car, a pension plan. These are not just things. They are freedom. They are comfort. They are security. And the more people get them, the less likely they are to want to disrupt the system that delivers those things. They are getting a piece of the action. And the better off you are, the more you're getting a piece of that action. And yes, there are threats coming at you, and you understand those threats, but not today. That's a thing for tomorrow, maybe. So that's a problem. And then, of course, some people don't have those things. They don't have freedom. They don't have security. They don't have comfort. None of that stuff. What they have is exhaustion at the end of the day from riding the bus from Scarborough to Etobicoke twice, and no opportunity to see their kids because they're working 2 or 3 jobs. And when they aren't working, they're exhausted, and they are seeking either to spend time with their kids or some kind of distraction. They don't have the energy or the time to think, oh, I'm going to take on advanced capitalism, right? So the system is really set up for the good guys not to win, right? Still, it makes sense that there has to be a tipping point. Things just can't get worse and worse for more and more people without them demanding change and eventually getting it. Personally, I think that tipping point arrives when a critical mass of people realize that to the ruling class, they simply don't matter at all. And you think of the Great Depression, where we had 20%, 25% unemployment, people living in tent cities who didn't think they were the kind of people who would ever have to live in a tent city, right? They thought, I've got a job, I've got a house, I'm doing fine, I'm working, and then suddenly they realize, no, they don't care about you. You're in a tent city. And when change happened after the Great Depression, especially in the United States, not in Canada so much, as a result of the Great Depression, it happened because people in tent cities were talking to each other, and they were mobilizing. And that's how you had what today would be considered extreme far left options being taken extremely seriously and resulting in all the changes that Roosevelt made, which actually saved capitalism, of course, but his view was somebody had to do it. But that's what you see when you see a class-based mobilization. An understanding of class came to the surface, and it made people take action. I'm really interested to hear the discussion this evening because reading David's book, what I want to know is what causes the tipping point, not the ecological disaster part. I get that. That's fairly straightforward. But what causes the tipping point going the other way, where people who are ripe for change, as David has shown that they are, actually make the change happen? What's the how, the when, the where, the why? How does that happen? So I'll stop there, and thanks again for the invitation, and I really look forward to the discussion, and I'll practice my Portuguese more later.
Now I want to invite Wally for his discussion.
So I need to get this onto my slides. Could you help me with that? Because it's way down. Yeah, way down. That's right. Yeah. Okay. That's the first one. No. Yeah. No. Well, along that line. Yeah. Yeah. There. No. That's David's stuff. Here. Start there. Yeah. Okay. And then if I just press down, I'm going to get the next one. Okay. So then go back. No. There. Okay. Yeah, there. Well, it's very enjoyable to be here. And I want to add dimensions of this whole question of societal change that have been important to me. And if you've read any of my work, you'll see that demography and incorporating demography and family in the changes in the change, for example, in my book on From Feudalism to Capitalism, changes in family forms from the peasantry to the working class was central to it. So that has always been a key element for me. So I want to then take the work that I have done. David asked me to produce some comparative statistics, and we chose together 12 developed capitalist countries, developed capitalist electoral democracies, and we have developed I have developed all kinds of data on them, and David has added the class dimension to it, and I want to share some of those slides with you today. So let's start then with the demography of aging in all the developed capitalist electoral democracies. Birth rates now are below replacement levels. 2.1 children per woman of childbearing age is what you need to have population growth if you don't have mass migration. And what we see in all of these countries, just take a look at, they're all now below 2.1, and many are very, very low. Canada, which was up at 3.9 back in 1960, as you can see, the red one is now down in the middle, and that is the kind of decline of fertility that we have seen in terms of births per woman. And now then, if you take a birth rate minus a death rate to get natural change, that is the change in population that does not come about through net migration, but before you get to that, and you see that this has dropped tremendously in Canada. As once again, it goes from the highest down now, and you see, if you notice where zero is, those 5 countries are below zero. That means, in fact, that they don't have any natural growth. The only growth that could occur in those societies is by means of migration. And so you get a sense of how dramatic this situation is. And I'm going to come back and put that. And so then you get net migration, which, as you can see, comes in some countries, which of course, if I go to, Greece, Italy, Spain, the UK, who in fact, back in the 1950s and 60s were, populating Canada to an enormous extent, and therefore you get those very, very low rates, and you get a very modest increase overall in these countries with tremendous fluctuations from one year to the other taking place as we had, and you can see the tremendous drop in the COVID 2020 year now starting to pop back up. Okay, so that then produces the foreign-born percentage of the population. And look where Canada is, the highest by far of all of these countries. There's Japan down at the bottom, which has almost had no immigration at all, and the other countries in the middle. And so you've had this thing. And here in Toronto, if you want to be clear, we're 50%. We're half immigrants. And that's from all over the world. I'm not saying from one particular place. That's from all over, because we have in Toronto has a population, has a respect for being one of the most mixed populations in the world, right here in Toronto. Mixed in terms of the inheritance, of where people have come from. 50% of our population are immigrants. And so if you put then immigration together with that natural population growth or decline, you get overall then what's happening. And you can see that in zero and negative. And several of these countries are negative, and the other ones are headed towards being negative. And so I just wanted to basically put that out there so you get a sense of this. And then what does that mean for the process of aging? You have the population 65 in proportion in this one to the population of 20 to 64 of the working age population. And you can see the tremendous increase in your retired population of the elderly, 65 plus, taking place here. And interestingly, that the lowest countries on that scale is the US and Canada, the black and the red. Okay, so then how are the elderly supported as a share of their living longer, as the share of them who are living longer than they were 30, 20 years ago occurs? A minority are working longer, over 65, and that is a possibility that you will have, in fact, a discussion about whether people's retirement age should go older. You have pensions, but the proportion paying into pensions today versus those who are receiving pensions, and you saw on the earlier slide in terms of the proportions between these two populations, is declining. So that means that these pension funds, the great majority of pension funds, survive in investing more of their funds in profitable companies. That's how they are surviving. And you have also then the importance of medical care for the folks of older ages, crucial in preserving the health of the elderly, paid mainly by the state from taxes. And then you have the final way in which the elderly are supported through their kids, their middle-aged children, supporting them. But nowadays, a great increase of those children of elderly parents are living far away from where their parents are living because they've gone somewhere else to work, etc. And they're not physically available to care for their parents. Okay. Now, what I want to do then is to put the politics of parties into the picture that David presented, because in fact, he's talking about class and class relations and class consciousness without actually then specifying the political parties involved in this process. And we have, I'll focus here on, first of all, on immigration, that as the planet heats up and weather patterns worsen in many hot, low-income countries near the equator, deteriorating viable food supplies and shelter, more people living in these countries are heading north. They're crossing the Mediterranean from northern Africa and the Middle East to get into Europe, and they're crossing the Rio Grande with the intention of entering the USA. And let's then reckon with the politics of these Western European and North American countries concerning migration from the South. We have, in both Canada and the US, we have a liberal and a conservative party that are both pro-capitalist, but in different ways. In the month of July 2021, and this is the US case, the US Customs and Border Patrol officials encountered 672 people on the US-Mexico border. And Biden's Homeland Security Secretary said it is critical that intending migrants understand clearly that they will be turned back if they enter the United States illegally and do not have a basis for relief under our laws. There's your position. And we know that, in fact, of this illegal population that snuck into the United States in the last 3 decades, there has been a constant discussion about whether they could and their children could become US citizens, and that has been repeatedly denied. And to this day, they are still all in a secret position and not members of the American citizenry. So, and here, a devil's advocate to the sense of the working class becoming more revolutionary is because the homegrown working class in these countries now increasingly, and I would say that for the European countries and in North America for the US and Canada, want to keep immigrants out to ease the competition for decent jobs and rental accommodation for housing. And they are attracted to right-wing parties. Consider the US, and then if I'll quickly go on to Canada. Trump and the Republican Party falsely claim that Biden and the Democrats keep the border open and admit all these people entering the US illegally. And this belief, which is a complete lie, this deception is a major reason why a large portion of the working class, especially in the southern states, support Trump and the Republican Party. Now, as conservative parties in all these Western European and North American countries move to the right and become increasingly authoritarian, and we could say, and some scholars have said, including those who have studied the fascism of the 30s and 40s, have studied Germany and Italy, for example, have talked now, one of those scholars talks about Trump as a fascist. I think, so I'll call him a neo-fascist. And these parties reject and reduce immigration, leading to populations that age and decline. That is the result. If you stop, recall those first slides, that's what's going to happen if we stop immigration and if we stop saying, oh, these people, they're not us. Get them out of here. Okay, so let's then look at the left in the United States. You have two capitalist parties, a liberal party and a party that's going to the far right under Trump. They still call it conservative, but I would not call it conservative anymore. I don't think that term makes any sense for what the Republican Party, and particularly the Trumpists in it, are now. And if, in fact, the left were to break from the Democratic Party and to form their own party and stop voting for Biden, and so you had, this considerable number of oppositional people that David talked about busting out of the Democratic Party, they'll lose, and Trump will be our next president in the United States. So that is an incredible capturing of the left inside the Democratic Party in the United States, because it's a two-party opposition. And if those people said, to hell with Biden and the Democratic Party, we're going to form our own party, and they stop voting, Trump is the next president of the United States. And that is a very, very frightening possibility, in my opinion, and why at this point in time, I frankly, and if I were in the United States as a leftist who's way to the left of the Democratic Party, I would be saying to people coming into the election in the United States, go and vote for Biden, because the alternative Trump is way, way worse. So you have two capitalist parties, but they operate in different ways. And the one that's going to the far right is really scary. So now then, let me talk about Canada. And I'll finish this. And like the US, in Canada, our national politics have been dominated by the back and forth elections of liberal and conservative parties, with the NDP and the Bloc Québécois on the left flank, but never gaining enough votes to form a federal government. So on the right, we had Stephen Harper, was the leader of the Canadian Alliance that emerged from the Reform Party in 2000. And in 2003, he negotiated the merger of the Canadian Alliance with the Progressive Conservative Party, that center-right party that had just been in utter decline and ended up in one election with only 2 members of parliament. And the merger resulted in the creation of the Conservative Party of Canada, which Harper led as its first leader, and he became the Prime Minister of Canada in 2006 after defeating the Liberal Party led by Paul Martin, and he remained in power until 2015 when he was defeated by the Liberal Justin Trudeau. Now look at this thing. Where did I go there? Yeah, look at this. There is the Harper years, and Canada is the lowest of all of these countries in terms of the electoral democracy index. This comes from VDEM, Varieties of Democracy, a superb study of democracy versus autocracy, which is showing, in fact, all the countries that are becoming more autocratic versus those that are becoming more democratic. And in fact, right now, the great majority of the world's major countries are becoming more autocratic in their terms than democratic. And then, so you see that in the Harper years, the Canadian, we are the lowest. And then when Trudeau and the Liberals beat the Conservatives, Canada pops up and goes back into the middle. So that was basically an assessment by the people that put together this, and all their Canadian researchers for where we were, and then look at what happens to the US, the black line, when Trump comes in 2016, drops right down like a stone from to the bottom, and so that's the other side of that. And then this is the vote for the far left parties, and you see that Canada pops up, and what is that? That's Jack Layton, and winning that vote in Quebec, where Canada, the NDP in Canada rose to have, I got my notes here. So the NDP was rising in the Jack Layton years, 2006, 2008 elections, from 29 to 37. And then in the 2011 elections, Layton led the NDP to the most successful result in the party's history. They won 103 seats, enough for the party to form the official opposition for the first time. And federal support for Layton and the NDP in the election was unprecedented, especially in the province of Quebec, where the party won 59 out of 75 seats. So I just wanted to add that element to say, there are the people that David was referring to coming into federal politics in that way at that time, a very positive moment for the left in the Jack Layton years, not nearly as powerful now as it was then, is in fact, and what I would say in terms of what David was showing us is we've got to put politics in at the top, because as I said, if you're in the United States now, and if you're on the left, you might want to say, well, to hell with Biden and the Democratic Party, but what is your alternative? I'm sorry, that situation of those two parties locking up the politics has made the position of the left extremely difficult politically, and that is a big part of the changes that are needed are at the political level. Okay.
Thank you. Dave, you wanna?
Sure. Okay, I'll be brief because I have a sense that we should engage in a wider debate here. I'll make 2 points. First, in response to Randy, the whole question of whether or not we have an emerging sixth extinction or whether we have some other kind of a resolution in front of us. And it is a fundamental choice that is facing us. That's my imminent threat point. And the only way we're going to avoid, unless we have another huge meteor hitting the Yucatan or somewhere else, which can happen any moment, I accept that. We all live with that. We all live with 92nd nuclear winter too. So we cope as best we can, but the basic point that I'm trying to get to is below politics, organized politics, beyond the conventional parties. Because if we look from a democratic socialist perspective at conventional party politics over the last 40 years, which is basically a neoliberal era in advanced capitalist societies, what we've had is all of the progressive parties, everything from left center on to the leftward conventional parties, moving increasingly toward a centrist position and toward a more authoritarian kind of a management process of an increasingly austere welfare state in an increasingly oligopolistic and profitable capitalism. That's the reality we're facing on the surface. What I'm trying to urge people to document, to understand, and to utilize as resources for mobilization is what's happening in terms of the sentiments and the everyday activities of more and more people, everyday people who are becoming politicized in one way or another and becoming more vulnerable to right-wing appeals in the absence of left-wing mobilization. And that's the fundamental join between parties, whether it's the NDP. Avi Lewis gave a heartfelt presentation of the Parkland Institute a few days ago, which basically makes the same point that I'm trying to, but without understanding the depth of the sentiments already there in grassroots, to say that there has to be more mobilization and all sorts of specific issues to engage people on real issues of survival, whether that's with the NDP or with other smaller political groups that have to come together through alliances between community organizing and political party organizing. So that's the prospect, it's the challenge, but it's also a situation which we face with more resources than most people presume, which is precisely why I'm suggesting we do these kinds of probes and assessments of people's sentiments and activism desires, because the major study that I was involved in was 2016 last. Since then, we don't have any real indicators aside from the expressions that are being made. As I said, we had more mobilization of social movement groups in the last 6 or 7 years than ever in history in terms of the scope and scale. And those sentiments and those desires and actions are there for mobilization. And there needs to be much more sustained efforts on the part of community organizations, and dare I say, an openness on the part of the conventional parties in Canada, certainly the NDP, toward those kinds of alliances. Parkland Institute did a little exercise a few weeks ago, or days ago, that you might be interested in terms of the number of activists that we're pointing to the issues and activities they could be engaged in. But there's a much wider population available for mobilization than most of the Parkland folks actually registered. So that's the basic point I'd like to make in terms of the vulnerability and the potentials with regard to extinction and political party mobilization. With regard to the issue about the United States in particular, I'll show you a little slide here. If anybody can see this, I'll just describe it in words for our podcast purpose. In February 21, the unfavorable, favorable sentiment of Americans to Donald Trump. February of 21, 57% unfavorable, 39% favorable. Fast forward to today, unfavorable, 52%, favorable, 43%. So the gap is closing. There's more toleration and pragmatic acceptance for Trump than there was. On the other hand, he still has a majority unfavorable rating if you're talking about basic sentiments among the population as a whole. That doesn't have anything to do with electoral colleges or particular mobilizations in particular areas. But there are some shards of hope there that one way or another, Trump and neo-fascism may be possibly avoided as a regime change at this point. It says nothing about the potential of Biden. I think Wally's right that for the immediate prospects, the left is going to have to come together, hold its nose, and vote for the guy. There isn't another immediate alternative that's going to be viable. Any independent movement in the next several months is going to effectively undermine the democratic alternative. So that's a desolate prospect for the immediate future. I agree. But in the meantime, there are many possibilities for mobilization for what's going to happen after that. Whether the unthinkable happens and he is elected, he isn't sent to prison. The sentiments of the population, of the judiciary, are indicative on that. They're running backwards as fast as they can to avoid any kind of a blockage to Donald that may in fact result in his ineligibility, regardless of the Constitution. But that's a deviation from what I am trying to emphasize here, which is the positive resources of hope that we have to engage with and to mobilize wherever we happen to be, locally or nationally, for trying to move toward a desirable future and avoid extinction. So I think I'll stop with that and open the floor to discussion, please.
We will now open any questions or comments to the floor. Oh, you think of some comments and questions. I do have a question actually to ask, if it's okay. To David, I was curious. It was fascinating the data you showed, and I gained a lot of hope from your data. I actually know somebody who participated virtually in COP28, and she's a Canadian, and she was hopeful to participate, but during the process, she felt a lot discouraged, considering how it went. And I think it shows that these large corporations are very international in scope. It's beyond the nation state.
Yeah,
and you show that the Canadian class consciousness is largely towards the left. But I wonder, how can we organize in the international level? Because it makes sense that Canadians have a leftist orientation according to the data, but if like globalization works concerted with the advanced capitalism. So I was curious about what your thoughts are on that.
Okay, I'll respond briefly to that. We obviously live in a global world with global issues, and we can't really, except with high arbitrariness and ethnocentrism, cut them off. So I think you have to start where you are, act locally, think globally. And one of the things that I'm trying to appeal to here is the importance of documenting the local in all societies. As I said, the studies that we've done over the last several decades are very lonely. Nobody else has done them in these other societies. So we need the kind of class analysis that we've done in Canada in all of these other countries. And none of the G7 or Nordic countries have done these kinds of simple tracking studies to know what the class forces are and their particular dispositions. Obviously, there's a need for international social movements, but the history of those international movements is fraught with difficulties, which is why I'm trying to concentrate my current efforts on mobilization in Canada through documentation and analysis and sharing, and to build that with colleagues in other places. But both in terms of the issue of global warming, climate change, and in terms of the political shifts, authoritarian shifts that Wally has documented here, for example, we have to recognize that these are world trends, and we have to be engaged in the most effective way we can in international collaboration and action, sharing and support, mutual support for other progressive forces, or else we have relatively little hope if we simply bury ourselves in narrow localities. So the basic response is we need to act locally with whatever collaborations and linkages we can, but we need global analyses. And what I've shared with you today is largely a Canadian-based analysis, which desperately needs a more global perspective.
Thank you. Kieran,
Yeah, thanks, David. Great to see you. I really appreciate what you were saying about it being a tipping point, because I think we do need that idea of the hope and the future and the need to really get active in terms of mobilizing, our communities. I guess I have a question. I have a question for you, but I mean, it's more like I'm interested in how you would respond to it rather than it actually being a question for me. But I'm wondering, why do you think class will be the basis of this solidarity? For example, when you think about the pandemic, one of the things that really raised, I think, was the way in which advanced capitalism really relies on free social reproductive labor. And if people stop doing that free social reproductive labor, things were going to collapse. And so I wonder, so that was sort of a basis for solidarity, which was not really just, I guess, class in the way we traditionally think about it. It was another thing, a basis of solidarity that was a different kind of solidarity. And then the other example is, you mentioned that the internationalism, that 50% of people who live here were not born here. Well, maybe that is a basis on which people will come together and find solidarity to challenge where we are today in capitalism. So I just am curious, why do you think still it is the category of class that will bring us together? Class alone, I guess.
Okay, I'll take that non-question. The point is not to be reductionist about this. As you know, Kieran, some of my research on conceptualization of class, and Wally's too, in a book we together. Standing in three legs. That is to say, you have to understand production relations, reproduction relations in the household, and also community relations as you reach out from households to build a politic. So I'm not trying to pursue or to argue for reductionism. What I'm trying to do is to argue that class needs to be brought back into the equation, in addition to race analysis, gender analysis, and if you're doing a relevant class analysis today, if more people were, it would be profoundly colored, as I suggested by those slides, by the changing racial composition and the increasing involvement in paid work by women. All of those elements need to be looked at more interactively than has been the case in traditional class analysis. And I dare say there's a lot of allusion to class in much gender analysis and race analysis that I've seen recently without engaging with actual class relationships, particularly in terms of paid work, which is one of the reasons I did the book, to try and bring that back in, but perish the thought that I would deny the relevance of race or gender in our contemporary reality, because it is increasingly obvious and evident that those dimensions have to be incorporated in any kind of critical progressive analysis and social movement. And many of the social movements we see around us today, as I suggested, are legitimately and compellingly organized around issues of race and gender. And I'm just arguing the class element needs to be brought in so that the class dynamics that are all around us don't undermine the gender and race objectives of equity. So that's a non-answer to your non-question.
Any other comments or questions?
I have a question. Well, let's go. I have a question. You started this event today asking if we agree it's possible to have management structures with no bosses. And I agree. And I'm curious here because I've been studying these structures and while I consider myself like a corporate activist. And I would like to know if you see this self-management movement inside corporations as a force of change or not. And if yes, why and how? And if it's clear.
Okay, let me articulate or re-articulate the question and tell me if it's in the ballpark. You're asking about the potential for change agents within corporations.
Yes.
Okay. My basic response to that is implied in some of the material here and a lot more of the material on the websites and in the Professional Power book. But basic point is that underemployment is a prevalent condition in Canada today, quite distinctively. UK and Canada are the two countries which have the most highly underemployed qualified labor forces that we're looking in terms of the qualifications that people bring to the job, the corporation in particular. So there are growing numbers of people who are underemployed in terms of their qualifications, who find the job control that they can exercise in their job as being undermined and diminished because I alluded to the middle managers who are increasingly surveilling you, the increasing surveillance and accountability mechanisms that are there in terms of the intelligence processes, computerized control systems. So that there are more and more people in more and more corporations who have more capacity than they're able to exercise in terms of the jobs that they have. That, I would say, is an increasingly pressurized situation. There's more demand, there's more anxiety, all of the ways in which people try to cope with those frustrating and alienating working conditions. And so you have the situation. I don't know if anybody here has ever heard of halagraphy, but there's a corporation, I think it's called the Zippo Corporation, and they sell shoes. And the guy who owned the place devised the notion that I've got a lot of people in my workforce who are, turning over, they're not staying very long. So I'm going to try economic democracy up to a point. I'm going to allow everybody in the firm to participate in all the decisions. Well, this was a fairly superficial process, but it resulted in an increasing productivity because more workers were more engaged with their work. The general point is that there are larger and larger numbers of people in virtually every corporation, certainly most private corporations, and throughout advanced capitalism, who are having more and more restricted job conditions, less job control. And that is something that private corporations have tried to deal with over this whole period through job enrichment schemes, worker quality schemes. The names have changed to fit the clientele, but there is a continuing set of initiatives by corporate leadership to engage the motivations of the employees, increasingly necessary because more and more work becomes intellectually focused. And so you have to some way maintain the motivation and the engagement of more and more of the workers as more and more of them are becoming underemployed and alienated. It's a fundamental challenge, and it's a fundamental potential for the union movement to mobilize more workers for more decent work and decent working conditions. And some unions are beginning to do that. But on the other hand, in terms of the potentials, they're not really inside most corporations, but involving linkages between corporations and union and professional associations that are working to try and facilitate better working conditions, better job control, better benefits. And those elements need to be part of any kind of social movement that's linking labor movements and social movements. Okay.
Any other questions, comments? I just want to check the time. We have 3 minutes, so maybe one more question.
Well, I would want to ask David. He defined three parts of the overall working class: the professional labor, the service workers, and the industrial workers. And then it described this decline in industrial workers, and of course then the loss of union percentage there. And then in the professional, in the top layer, of the working class that he has defined, because he's broken with this notion that they're all part of some sort of professional class, to see that in fact there is a labor component there. I would want to then ask two questions broadly about the labor movement and the trade unions. One is, are those professional associations now increasingly engaged with the labor movement? Do they go to the to the big labor conferences, etc.? And is there a connection then between those professional associations and the labor movement that came originally in Canada and the US from the industrial unions? But then the second question, which really gets me, because I think that so often we leave out the service workers and all those people in those supermarkets, etc., is what is the effort in the labor movement to organize the service sector, and is that working? Because if you think about that thing that you talked about people being both, you know, workers for wages and also consumers going to, you know, all of these stores where all of these service workers work. I mean, what would it, you know, what would we be able to do if we could have, in fact, a significant growth of the trade unions in the service sector?
Okay, this may be my last word before the podcast ends. So a couple of things. I will respond directly to Wally, but just to point out that there are copies of the book here. And if anybody's interested, you can get a reduced price on it until January 27th. So that's my word for Fernwood Publishing. In response directly to Wally, again, a resource of hope with regard to professional employees, because they, non-managerial professional employees, are the most highly organized class group in this society and in all of these advanced industrial societies. They are either members of professional associations or members of trade unions or both. And they are the most highly organized of all workers today. So their potential for mobilization is very large indeed in terms of their capacity to mobilize themselves and to ally with others. And just as a particular indicator, in the study that we did, and there were in the Professional Power Book project, we did case studies with engineers and nurses, representative samples of both. And we found that nurses had the highest pro-labor oppositional consciousness of any group we studied. Over 70% of them have pro-labor oppositional consciousness in these terms. They are a highly mobilizable group. And if you look at their views on the question that you split, a no-profit economy, again, a vast majority, not uncoincidental with the fact that most of them are public sector workers, but again, some progressive resources for mobilizational hope. With regard to service workers, I would just say that part of the challenge is their fragmentation in terms of small workplaces and precarious work conditions. But if we take any credence from the survey research that we did, we find that their pro-labor oppositional class consciousness and the incidence of revolutionary labor consciousness is just about as high among service workers as it is among industrial workers today. And so there, again, are potential mobilizing people, but the challenge among service workers is partly that they are less well organized at this point. They need to be more organized. The professional unions and the industrial unions have to engage in more increasingly in mobilizing them. QP unions, for example, need to engage with more private sector organizations as well. So again, these are shards and elements of hope, which we need to pay more attention to. There needs to be more documented research of this sort. Unions such as QP and others today could be doing these kinds of studies that I did in 2016 within a matter of days. All you need with the social media society we live in today, and the fact that everybody has a cell phone, except me, that there is an accessibility for representative samples at all levels, from a local community to a nation, if organized groups, unions, professional associations, and associated researchers, such as virtually anybody in this room, could be engaged. Those kinds of studies could be done almost instantly today to aid and abet the mobilization of progressive forces. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I apologize a little bit more over time, but actually shows the enthusiasm that we all have for the book. So please check out the book, and thank you all, David, Brandy, and Wally, for all your great talk.
Thank you.
This has been another episode of Work, Learning, and Social Change, Foundational Voices. Please consider exploring our other episodes and series. And if you like what you find, why not consider subscribing or following us on YouTube or Spotify so that you don't miss a thing.